everyone, welcome to another edition of an international series with international guests on the Soccer Performance Podcast. We have a special guest for you today. This is Jack Clover. Jack currently works at Man United Women's in the first team in the Women's Super League in England. And previously he was at Everton for several seasons. So Jack's going to, bring a lot of insight and valuable information, I feel, for the viewers at home. So we'll introduce Jack. Jack, you mind kind of chatting a little bit about your origins and, what you're up to nowadays?
Yeah, no problem at all. Firstly, thanks very much for having me on. Always good to come on and chat all things physical performance, particularly when we're talking about football. Always happy to chat about those sort of things. So my background kind of started off same as probably a lot of people who work in sport, like sport mad kid, played lots of different sports as a kid. Probably got interested in fitness because I maybe lacked a little bit of talent in a few of those sports. So fitness was a way for me to sort of push myself forward when I was playing. So basically skipping through a few years of my personal sporting career, I ended up going to Liverpool John Moores University to study exercise science. To be honest, I went there purely from a point of view of the northwest of England is a hotbed of sport, and I knew that was a great place to be for football, rugby, cricket. Everything was going on in the northwest of England. I also kind of ended up at one of the best universities in the country, possibly in Europe and the world as well, Liverpool John Moores University, sort of through chance. And then I got really interested in, I guess, physical performance and strength and conditioning as a concept probably in my second year at university when that was kind of introduced to me by some of my lecturers. I was always interested in coaching before that. I was interested in personal training, but that was the first time I really got the idea of the concept of training fitness for a sport specifically. So as soon as I left university, I wanted to go and find myself a job in strength and conditioning. I met a lot of challenges with that in terms of how competitive the market is. So I ended up going and interning in professional cricket, worked in professional cricket for a year, realised I needed to know more, needed to upskill myself. So I spoke to a couple of my lecturers at John Moores Uni, Professor Graham Close, Dr. James Morton, and they sort of pointed me towards master's study. So at the time, there wasn't a huge amount of opportunity to study strength and conditioning. So I went down the exercise physiology route. So I studied exercise physiology back at Liverpool John Moores. I was also running a personal training business out of two gyms at the time. And I then managed to get a job at the university working with the TASK program. And then a couple of months later, through some players I was working with, I ended up in a job at Everton Women as well. So this is going back 6 or 7 years now. So I was doing a lot at the same time. So I eventually finished my master's, and over time, as the Everton role became more full-time, as the women's game became more professional in the UK, I transitioned into just football. So I kind of left the university work, I left the personal training work, and I did 6 years at Everton, which started out working with every team from the under-10s to the senior team all at the same time, to much more of a full-time professional model, where I was just focusing on strength and conditioning, more gym-based, more injury prevention, more rehabilitation. And then bringing you up to sort of present day, I currently do a little bit of consulting work with FIFA around preparing some of the FIFA member associations for competition in the FIFA World Cup and qualification for that. So I've done that for about a year and a half. And then in May, I started the job at Manchester United that you mentioned, as first team physical performance coach. And I've just finished my pre-season there, and we're into the Women's Super League season. And that pretty much brings you up to date.
All right, cool. So a lot of history there. You mind just touching a little bit on, because the FIFA thing I didn't know. Mind just touching a little bit on there, like what exactly you're doing there? And
yeah, no problem. That's a really interesting project. So about probably 18 months ago, actually probably closer to 2 years ago, was contacted about an opportunity to basically try and develop the physical performance side of some of the countries in the Oceania region who didn't have the same support as maybe UK, Canada, US, some of the European teams do. Because the next Women's FIFA World Cup is in Australia and New Zealand, there was a big push for the Oceania nations. So the project started out like that, and it developed over a year, kind of branched out to some nations in Africa as well. So I actually ended up working with the South Africa women's national team remotely, a very minor input, just a little bit of help here and there, around preparing for camps, preparing for competitions. And they actually won the Africa Cup of Nations, so that was, I take no credit at all for that, but they they did really well, which is great. So they're now qualified for the World Cup. So the plan is to continue either working with them or potentially work with another nation leading into qualification for the World Cup next summer.
Now, when you're kind of, given the task to kind of oversee or give some consultancy to some of these nations where they're a bit behind in their physical development, what are some areas of improvement that you notice right away, or perhaps maybe it's just structures in place that they don't have? Is there anything that really stands out to you that really needs work? Or
I think, to be completely honest, like, I've been very privileged in some of the environments I've worked in. I've worked in a very good university. I've worked in 2 Premier League clubs. So I suppose I probably was quite surprised by the lack of funding some of these nations actually have, and some of the kind of basic level. I mean, South Africa are probably one of the better nations. They've got fantastic coaching staff, but even they struggle with some of the facilities and where they can train. And I think the major difference was from their side was the standard of the competition that their players were playing in, week out. So they had a lot of work to do in terms of getting their players from their club level, their university level, up to international competitions. That was probably the main challenge for them. We helped them a lot with basic profiling, basic testing to kind of benchmark their players against where we thought they potentially needed to be. And we just gave them some simple conditioning work, some simple strength training work that they could do. A lot of them in South Africa, a lot of them are based at universities, so did a lot through that. But like I said, it was fairly minimal input, but those were kind of some of the big rocks that we kind of went after.
And in terms of physical development, do you find, like, I guess maybe it's hard to compare versus as they're distant, but is there a way, like, perhaps, like, you see that, okay, perhaps they're lacking in strength, or their conditioning levels are much lower than the women at the higher game? So you're obviously working with the women at the highest level there. So what do you kind of see at the lower levels, the difference in their physical ability, if you do see any differences? Perhaps it's all just completely technical, but I was wondering if you see any big difference which came out.
I think it was probably more on the conditioning side. I think basically just the intensities of their league didn't match up to international football. And I would say potentially in the men's game, international football maybe operates at slightly lower intensities than, say, Premier League football, which is very high intensity, or maybe La Liga football or Bundesliga football. Whereas in the women's game, I think the international game probably operates at a slightly higher level than some of the domestic leagues, because not all of the domestic leagues are full-time professional. So I'd say that was probably the main thing, that their domestic league wasn't preparing them for international competition.
Okay, interesting. So it really comes down to, like, intensity of play. Sometimes it's not even down to just simply, follow this gym program. It's pretty much the level of football you play. That is where most of your conditioning should come from. And if you're playing at intense enough, you should be fit enough to play. Because me and Juan talk a lot about kind of over here in Canada, like, the level of play is much lower. I don't know if you noticed that in terms of the women's game, but, like, especially for the men's, like the level of play is much lower. They don't play at a high enough tempo, and therefore they suffer in that regard. Where actually, I think in terms of strength, power, and speed, we do have that, but it's just our players here are not used to play at a high enough tempo and playing with intent each and every day. And of course, the players surrounding them, if they're at a higher level, then you naturally get that higher tempos, more high speed running, more intense play, which is critical for physical development.
Yeah, Jack, let me ask you this, because Mario and I, we talk about a lot of players have the ambition, both male and female, to go play in England, being obviously one of the prime targets. And I don't think they understand, you're a product of your environment. So they've been playing at a certain speed, a certain, intensity, and then they want to go take this leap and compete versus players who've been playing at a much higher intensity day in and day out, much higher level of competition. So what do you notice? Because I mean, I at least here we see that Canada, women's national team has a good reputation around the world, and it's got players playing in big clubs. But what do you notice between, let's say, the Canadian player and the standard Canadian player, if there's even a standard Canadian player, and the standard British player, in terms of difference of play, and what could a player who's, let's say, looking to go from like a D1 scenario to now a professional game, what's that jump like?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I think to be fair, I think players from the US and Canada have historically done pretty well in the women's game in the UK. I think the ones that have kind of made that jump across, I think actually probably in Canada, from what I've seen, there's probably a pretty good, as you say, sort of strength, power, movement, grounding. Maybe that comes through your high school and college systems. So actually the players, well, I've only worked with one Canadian player, and she's an excellent athlete. She'll run all day. She'll work at a very high intensity. So from my personal experience, and from other Canadian players I've seen within the league, they hit the level very well. I think potentially the game in the UK maybe is a slightly more tactical game than I see sometimes in the US. I don't know that much about the Canadian leagues, but I think actually players in the US physically tend to do very well in the UK. Right. I'm not 100% sure why that is. You guys will probably know better than me.
No, and I think, I mean, it's just, I think it ends up being just style of play. It's not, I don't know if there's a right or wrong, but we noticed that too, that I think that the ambition is still to go play in these big clubs in Europe. And as much as, we're talking about the physical aspect of it, it ends up being these technical players that can kind of hold on and actually make a difference with the ball at their feet. I think from a global level and a national team level, like you said, the strategy is clearly there that Canadian teams do well being physical and being strong. But I think when it comes to individual players wanting to play at these, call them prestige clubs, I think there's still a bigger emphasis on what's done on the ball and tactically than per se, physically. Right? Mayor, what do you think?
Absolutely. And that kind of leads to my next question. I was wondering, Jack, I think maybe back in the day, at Liverpool, you kind of mentioned to me a bit. You did have a group of players who did kind of leave England, play D1 in the States, then come back. And I was wondering, do you think that them playing in that, I think you mentioned physically they really improved, but then also do you think that it may have came at a detriment to some technical and tactical development because they kind of went and played in that system versus if they, played in in England, they would develop more technical and tactical ability. So do you think there was a bit of a trade-off there with some of those players?
Yeah, possibly. I always see it as the physical aspect of the game won't make you a elite professional or international player necessarily. it might give you one or two sort of X factors and super strengths if you're very, very fast, or if you're one of those players that can run all day, or you're great out of possession. But I don't think it's going to make you a player. Whereas I think the physical aspect of the game will potentially stop a very talented player making the grade.
Mhm.
That's generally the way I think of it. And I think you're right. I think the players I've worked with that have gone over to the US, whether it be to study and then train and come back, they've always been really competent in the gym, strong, powerful. They always have good conditioning, good foundation fitness, which really helps. I think that was definitely the way things were done going back a few years. A lot of the players I work with now who are a bit older went over and played in the States for a few seasons or even a couple of years and then came back, whether that be at university level or in NWSL. But I think now there's maybe a bit more of a trend towards players staying. I'm not really sure why that is. Possibly because in the women's game, the academy system sort of improved a little bit. But I still think in the women's game, it's a long way off the men's game in terms of, you've worked in men's academies, you've seen what that's like. It's a much bigger jump, I think, in the women's game to go from, say, a under 21s team to a women's first team from a physical perspective. I think in the men's game, a men's under 23s team in the UK, they're going to be extremely fit. They're going to be very fast, very strong. They'll be physically very ready. Not sure if that entirely answers your question. I've kind of gone off on a little bit of a tangent there. But I think
it's good. And I think I don't know if you guys agree with me, but it seems like, and as much as we're talking about the physical aspect of it, I think it's the whole point is to show to show players the truth. And I think you can't be a professional player, I think, at all if you don't have that technical, ability and that tactical understanding. But then when you want to be a great player versus a good player, even in that professional environment, and you really tap into taking care of your physical work, that's where you now mark the line. That's where you mark the difference between you and your competition, right? I think when you're now at a level where it's, if you're a little bit faster than the competition, if you're a little bit stronger, that's going to now put you in a different pool of players, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting, and how you pointed out that you see a larger gap from under 21 women's to the first team women's. That to me is interesting. And we know I guess you'll know better. It's slowly improving over time, I guess, in the academy system. More funding is being given to the women's academies, but it's also interesting, and I think you'll have better insight on this. In Canada, we don't even have a league for the women's. Yeah. And we just have a league now for the men's, like a Canadian professional league as of like a couple seasons ago. So for us, there's such a big gap from, when they finish an under 18, whatever youth team they play, and then what do they do? You know what I mean? Where here it's even more confusing, I think, because we have way less structure here. So I guess what I'm trying to think is, like, how do we help, those 18-year-old players, who have some talent and they have aspire to break into a first team somewhere. Normally here they go the D1 route, or some players actually do head over in Europe in terms of the women's game. What is the best way of action? Let's say, Juan, in your mind, from a Canadian perspective, and let's say Jack, what is stopping the development there? Is it simply like they're just not there's just not enough funding? They're not playing enough at the under 21 level? And
I think even if you wanted to start in Canada, I think if you wanted to go and look at it from a local perspective, and I think this is where the advantage comes. It's interesting. I think it's an interesting situation because it's strange that like a country does so well on a national level without a league. I think it's kind of strange, and it's not something that I don't think it's a system to follow, right? I don't think that's they're doing something right by not having a league. But it's interesting, and that's what I think in Canada, the national team doesn't really represent, the Canadian player, right? I think there's a big disconnect between players that are playing at high level. It's a very small percentage, and then just recreational, let's say, call them like competitive players playing rep soccer, we call it here, which is just your average, I guess, competitive player that's not in any professional environment. And I think until a country is able to have an option where you don't have to leave, then you can never really have a true system, right? I think you guys are lucky enough to have a high level league, and so that's going to be an incentive for players to stay. I think Canada is stuck in a position where the goal is to leave, right? The goal is to leave. The goal is to always get out, and then the big goal is to get to the national team. I think players go to the D1 route. They don't really want to go to school. They just want to play professionally, but they just choose that route. I think it's very unclear the way that Canada is structured right now. And I think now that it all goes back to obviously participation. Now that more women are playing, I think there's going to be a bit more reason to have a league. But I think that's in Canada. It's super interesting. I don't know right now if you could say that Canada is a footballing nation from the women's side, just because the women's national team as well. You got to look at like the academies, the U17s, are the U19s, are the U16s doing well as well. So it's interesting. I'm not too caught up with the younger age groups, but Jack, how does the British national team in the youth age groups do in the world?
Firstly, I think that's really interesting because I didn't know that Canada don't have that kind of women's structure in terms of a league, and that's really interesting given how many top players Canada have produced over the years. And I can think of sort of 4 or 5 very good players who play in the WSL and in Europe, and obviously they were successful. They won the Olympics as well, so that's really interesting to me. In England, there's a kind of, they call it a regional talent club system. So not all the clubs have one, but some of the main clubs have one. And actually, my previous club, Everton, were very successful through theirs, and my current club, Man United, are very successful through their RTC program. So they're kind of two of the biggest ones, I'd say, in the north anyway. And they're very closely linked with the FA. So they get support and structure through the national governing body, which is the FA. So, for example, over the last few years, part of the kind of agreements, part of the licensing for the FA funding youth women's football has been, you have to have your S&C coaches, you have to have people around education support, you have to have physiotherapists. So I think that's quite a good system. And obviously then the best players from that compete for England at youth level. And I think generally England have been pretty successful at youth level over the years, and then kind of recent years haven't quite produced that at senior level, up until the Euros over the summer, where obviously they did very well. But yeah, so there's quite a clear structure, I'd say now. But where there's a gap is probably that under 16s to senior players. I think a lot of the time the players that make it successfully in the league, I guess it's similar in men's, but if you're at the level at 16, 17, you'll go straight into a WSL first team squad. Mm-hmm. Whereas, and there's still that kind of gap between the players that are not quite at that level at 16, 17, but maybe would make it at 2021. There's a bit of a gap there. Some of those players get lost, I think, in my opinion. Mm. Maybe that's where players actually benefit from going over to the US, because in the US there's a much better kind of university college level program than in the UK.
Right.
So it's important that, rather than, because I think here a lot of players get lost, more so in the men's game, but those women there, if they go in the States, they play 4 years, at least they're still playing, and then maybe they still have a shot of making it back in the WSL. Basically what you mean there. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Is there any, so you touched on obviously the most talented players at 16 and 17, like they get spotted and they'll break in. Is there any I don't want to say defining qualities, but anything that stands out for players that, let's say, do eventually make it into the first team in the WSL and then will let's say part two of the question is, okay, you have some internationals, European champions in your squad. What do you notice? Is there any like difference in terms of those players who make it to the highest level versus the squads who don't make it to that national team level? Does it all just come down to technical and quality and stuff like that?
Yeah, I wanted to know also regarding that question, is there a big mentality, is that the big defining factor? Is it a mental thing? Is it just the way that they carry themselves? If you could touch on that in terms of the culture that these like real professionals kind of set for these younger players.
Yeah, so there's kind of like two parts to that. I think in terms of quality, like I agree with what you guys said before. Like the technical piece is extremely important. You have to be technically good enough, number one. And as I said, like you can be technically good enough, you can make it into WSL squad. Potentially the physicality, if you're not robust enough, if you're not strong enough and fast enough, you might get lost in that system a little bit. But you can probably still make it. I think in terms of defining qualities, there's probably, because the professional league in the UK is still fairly new. So I think you can still make it to the top level if you've got that physical X factor and you're not technically the best player. But typically the players I see coming into my environment are already technically excellent. It's just a case of me maybe just adding the finishing touches in terms of getting them fit, strong and robust enough to tolerate the league. I think it's more that way around. And then in terms of mentality, as I said, it's still a newly professional league. So like I said, the club I was at previously was only professional sort of 2 or 3 years ago, and the club I'm at now has only been in existence 4 years, I think. So so it's still very new. So there's players in the squad I work with now who were working full time, and they were also full internationals at the same time when they were 21, 22 years old. Yeah. So the professional mentality is, I guess, a new thing, really. And I think there's still, trying to think what the best way to put this is. There's probably there's still kind of players are still coming around a little bit to football being their full-time job. So that professional mentality is still being developed, I think, and that's the same for me. Like 4 or 5 years ago, I wasn't full-time professional, so the support I could give was only part-time. Whereas now I've got the luxury of I'm full-time. I can see players 5-6 times a week. I can get them in the gym 3 or 4 times a week. I can work with them on the pitch every day. So so that's a massive difference, massive improvement.
Very interesting. Do you find that the players coming up, right, the players that end up, you're saying that make that professional jump, if all the qualities are there, what stands out, right? What is it? Is it, for example, having those qualities at a younger age? I know that in men's football, obviously, if you can spot a kid at 15, 16 who has the physical qualities, the technical abilities, has the maturity and the mindset to want to be a pro. But is that similar on the women's side? Do you find that I'm curious with that.
Yeah, I think some of the best youth coaches I've worked with, I'm talking like football coaches now rather than physical, have been able to spot a player that can do something a little bit different and do something a little bit special from a football point of view. Right. And for me, I'd always say to those kind of coaches, like, let me worry about the physical. We'll get them up to speed with that. The most important thing is they have that that thing that makes them a top player. That could be I don't know, a player who just knows what to do when they pick up the ball in tight spaces. They can play under pressure. A player that can pick out a pass. A player that can score goals from anywhere or wherever that might be. I wouldn't say there's one specific thing.
Right.
And then I think I just think for that player, as the league becomes more professional over the years, the physical side to that is increasing and increasing. So the level they have to be at is increasing and increasing. So I guess the job's kind of becoming harder for me in a way, because there's maybe more work to be done, rather than a player who, like, maybe 2 or 3 seasons ago they could have walked straight in without that physicality behind them. They could have walked straight into a WSL team and done well. So that's probably where it's changing.
Very
That's
interesting.
very interesting. Because, you know, we've talked a lot on this podcast about, okay, you know, people obviously want advice for physical, you know, things that they can implement, but we always hint out that, like, well, you need that technical ability first. So from your perspective there, it sounds like, okay, let's identify these potential players, and then we can worry about, okay, what are their physical gaps versus, you know, players that are just like, okay, let me get as fast as possible, as strong as possible, as fit as possible. But, like, you know, if they can't play, if they can't pick out that pass, play in those tight spaces, then I mean, it's really doesn't matter. They won't hit that level. So I think just to kind of close off, you kind of brought that back and kind of highlighted the importance of that, how players are who are talented now. It's just not enough. Like, you know, become the best possible player you can, and then, you know, the work doesn't stop there. Now the physical development becomes important. That physical work is needed for you to play at the highest level, or at least keep you there. Because it seems that, as you've mentioned, over the last few years, the physical level in the women's game is just keeps increasing.
Yeah, and I think to kind of
Sure.
close off, because I think a lot of the players that listen to us are obviously Canadian, and to kind of guide players that want to make that jump overseas, if you can focus on having a real technical foundation, and not, you know, leave physical work to the side, but just maintain and keep up with that. But I think a lot of players sometimes in Canada get caught up with, okay, I'm just gonna go to the gym, and in doing so, I'm gonna become a better footballer. And I think the main takeaway I'm getting, and I want to continue to preach, is that you have to have your football qualities first, and then everything that you're doing in the gym is to complement you as a footballer, right? If you have that mentality, I think you'll be okay.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think if you're a young player sort of listening to this, I'd sort of push you towards focusing on the basics. So don't worry about your kind of top end physical performance work. So your kind of max speed work and your kind of anaerobic conditioning work. I'd focus on the basics. So make sure you move really well, because movement's the foundation of strength. And when you move well, you're more efficient, so you can run for longer. When you move well, you're more robust, so you're less likely to get injured. So for me, if we sign a player, or I inherit a young player who moves really well and they're a very good footballer, I know I can develop that player. If I'm getting a player at 18, 19 who struggles to move well, that's a much bigger challenge for me, because I've got to do a lot of work before I can get to that top end work, that real kind of fine detail work. So that would be kind of what I would focus on. I'd really focus on the movement side.
Perfect. No, that's great, because everyone here especially loves the more advanced work, but at those young ages, and we spoke about in an academy setting, the sessions are actually way more basic and fundamental than people would like to think over here. Like, especially, like, you know, from what I've seen in the academy, you know, the under 14s, it's very basic, fundamental movement, strength.
Mhm.
And so exactly, by the time, you know, someone like you gets a hand of the player, you want a player with a nice foundation that you could just now build on, versus, oh, now let's go back. Okay, we got things to fix. But to wrap up, you know, we're on got 30 seconds here left. Jack, thank you. I think this is very, you know, very informal and educational. Where can people find you if they, you know, want to look you up or kind of get in touch, potentially ask some questions?
Yeah, I mean, like LinkedIn or Twitter are always good ones. You can just search me on LinkedIn, shoot me a message. I'm not the quickest person at replying to messages, but I'll always get back to people, because, as I said, I love chatting about this kind of stuff. I have no idea what my Twitter handle is, but I can share it with you. And
We'll find it. We'll put it in the file.
Sorry.
No worries.
So maybe Twitter's not.
My Instagram's all pictures of my dog and coffee and stuff like that. Nothing that interesting.